Good morning. Thanks to everyone for coming, particularly to Cameron, who's come to speak to us from Dignity in Dying. Just a few quick admin points, and then we'll get started with the meeting proper. So we are recording this morning's meeting. If you don't want to be seen, you can turn your video camera off. So we leave that to you. I was going to say that we've muted everybody, but I'm now going to say we failed to mute everybody, or in fact, we failed to mute anybody. You know where the sound controls are to adjust your screen. I won't go through that again. And we'll do questions at the end. So when Cameron has finished speaking, we'll pick that up. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to just ask Ted if I can. Yeah, just to say a few words of blessing to get us started, please, Ted.
Right. Well, I thought, given this morning that a couple of short prayers would be appropriate. It's taken me 15 minutes to log in this morning, and there may be other people who are having to struggle as much as I have to get in. This morning we pray for those in their final stages of life. May their fears and distress be met with true compassion, one which finds expression in treating the dying person with love, with dignity, and the appropriate palliative care. We pray for all those working in health and social care, especially those involved in the end-of-life care. We give thanks for their extraordinary dedication and loving care for the sick and dying, particularly during this pandemic. And may the Holy Spirit give us all wisdom and understanding to know how to follow Christ by bringing his support and love to those in great need. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Ted. Now, for the first time in ages, we have no Colin today, but he did email his apologies. He said he'll not be able to Zoom in. I will be in Canterbury helping Sue prepare for her 175 guest celebration, 14 months after her only 30 wedding. I'm looking forward to the YouTube recording next week. We hope your Saturday will be both satisfying and fruitful, enjoyable and restful. Now, I don't know what Colin has on the menu, but I'm guessing it's not bacon sandwiches. So Colin's joke's now bacon sandwich. We'll have to go on hold for now, but more of that later. Okay, so moving on to the main event of the morning. Our speaker is Cameron from Dignity in Dying. And by way of introduction, let me just remind you what I said in the invitation email. Cameron studied German language, literature and philology at Oxford. He's had 3 careers as a merchant banker, CEO of a quoted financial services company, and then as a book and magazine publisher and author. In retirement, he is chairman of the local history society and a performing musician. He was a director of the campaigning group Dignity in Dying for 6 years until 2018, when he became trustee treasurer of its sister charity Compassion in Dying. So, Cameron, if I can just figure out you in the spotlight, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me this morning. I'm very sorry I have to be rushing off, but it's Heritage Weekend, I think throughout the country, and I have to take 2 tour groups on guided walks around Ripley. It just happens to be today and tomorrow. So I will dive in. My topic this morning is obviously not a light-hearted one. I want to give you my views on the concept that some terminally ill people with mental capacity should, subject to strict controls, be given the right to choose a medically assisted death. These are people who are already within months of death. We're talking about letting us have the option to avoid or at least reduce really intolerable suffering at the end of a life which is about to finish anyway. The organisation once known as the Voluntary Euthanasia Society, and now as Dignity in Dying, campaigns for a law that would give people who are terminally ill, have mental capacity, as certified by 2 doctors, are likely to be within the final 6 months of their life, the option of dying at the time and place of their choosing. Public support for a change in the law has been overwhelming for many years, but the campaign faces well-funded antagonism from several sources. Interestingly, official antagonism from the various medical colleges is gradually shifting, and on Tuesday of this week, the BMA changed its stance from being opposed to being neutral on the issue, which brings them in line with the Royal College of Nursing and the Royal College of Physicians. So none of them is now opposed. There's a vocal lobby against from some disability groups led by Tanny Gray-Thompson in the House of Lords. The Catholic Church remains implacably opposed, but open antagonism from the Church of England has all but disappeared. Archbishop Carey wrote recently in the British Medical Journal that assisted dying should be legalised and that there is nothing holy about agony. He said letting terminally ill patients die as well as possible is a compassionate and religious approach and better than making them suffer, and that there is nothing in the scripture that directly prohibits assisted dying. In the same article, Rabbi Jonathan Romaine wrote, "A belief in the sanctity of life is not a belief in the necessity for suffering." Now, Parliament tends quite rightly to lag behind shifts in public opinion, but the House of Lords voted in favour of a law change in 2015. And Dignity in Dying's research shows that the House of Commons is now roughly 50-50 split, with a number of cabinet members and the former Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, supportive, at least of a review of the law. Matt Hancock said, "The law today is not here by design, but as a result of a series of legal decisions, and it doesn't work properly." In the Lords, Baroness Finlay is a vocal objector, relying heavily on the argument that a law change would open up the vulnerable to coercion to take their own lives in order not to be a burden or for financial gain by unscrupulous relatives. But the law proposed would contain stringent safeguards to protect people and reduce the possibility of this kind of pressure being applied. I'll come back to this as it's the most common objection that we hear. Assisted dying would only be accessible to mentally competent adults. 2 doctors would assess the person making the request to ensure they met this eligibility criterion. And the doctors would explain all the other available care options, including palliative care. A High Court judge would then examine the person's request and ensure it was being made voluntarily and free from pressure or coercion. Once a request was approved, the doctor would be allowed to prescribe life-ending medication for the person, who would then take it themselves at the time of their choosing, but under the supervision of a doctor or other healthcare professional. Now, Dignity in Dying does not campaign for euthanasia, where a doctor might actively end a person's life, nor do they campaign to provide assisted dying to those who are not already facing an imminent death, i.e., it's not a solution for depression, severe disability, nor in cases of dementia. The proposed law is based on one that's operated in Oregon, USA, for 24 years, though we add additional safeguards here, such as the judicial review. There have been no reported cases of abuse of Oregon's law, and no extension of its eligibility criteria over that whole period. This model of assisted dying legislation has since been adopted in 9 other American states, passed by lawmakers in 4 Australian states, in New Zealand, and it's on the way in Canada. It's under active review in the Republic of Ireland, Jersey, and is about to come before the Scottish Parliament later this year. The campaign for assisted dying seeks the right of terminally ill people to end intolerable suffering with the help of their doctors. That's all. People can take their own lives. They've been able to do that since the Conservative government in 1961 introduced the Suicide Act. Suicide was illegal once, remember that? That's why it was called committing suicide. If you tried to kill yourself and failed, you might well get arrested. Now, if you help a terminally ill relative to die as they wish to, you might well get arrested. People still do it, of course, because we have a natural urge to help the suffering, especially if they're close to us. But if we do, we face not only the possibility of criminal sanction, but the certainty of criminal investigation. We can be charged and sentenced for helping someone to do something which is not illegal. It's also not illegal to go to a country where assisted dying is allowed, Switzerland, Holland, and so on, but it's illegal for someone else to buy the plane ticket for you. It also costs around £12,000 to £15,000, which not everybody can afford. Now, I know I'm being slightly flippant here because the law was certainly designed to protect the vulnerable, where assisting is a euphemism for encouraging. And I'll come back to this, but the fact is that the law as it now stands is not working, and it has a number of what I'm certain are unforeseen consequences. I want to tell you a personal story here as it'll exemplify just one of these unforeseen consequences and help explain why I became actively involved in this campaign. My parents, both born into working class families in Lancashire in 1923, were early supporters of the Euthanasia Society. My brother and I were brought up in a house where my parents each had a marmalade jar with a label on it saying exit. Every time they got a prescription from the doctor, they'd put a few pills into the jar, and they explained that if their lives ever became intolerable, they wanted an easy way out, rather than one of the less pleasant ways of committing suicide. I'm not sure how much they'd thought through how effective these out-of-date aspirins might be, but I understood and agreed with the principle, the argument that you wouldn't let an animal suffer like this. Fast forward 85 years. My father's died with Alzheimer's. My mother's depressed, but in not too bad shape physically, and is in a care home. I get a phone call from her saying, "I've got to leave in a month." She'd been handed a lawyer's letter giving her 30 days notice to quit, as the management were concerned that she intended to take her own life and that they might be implicated in assisting a suicide if they let her stay. A staff member had found her exit bottle. The manager had called the police. They'd searched my mother's room without a warrant, found an undated, unsigned farewell letter addressed to my brother and me. She was smart enough still to know that something like that letter is best prepared in a calm frame of mind, not as you're just about to take the final step. She certainly had no plans to sign and date it at that time. Cut the long story short, I took legal advice, went to see the team at Dignity in Dying, who told me there were several cases a year like this, to their knowledge. We found her another home where she died naturally a couple of years later. Meanwhile, my brother, who lived close to her care home, a retired vet, was arrested in a dawn raid by officers in 3 police cars, who also searched his house without a warrant, on the basis that he was suspected of supplying drugs to assist a suicide. He was released the same day, and he later received a letter of apology from the Chief Constable of Shropshire. But it shouldn't have happened. I later accepted that the care home had had to act as it did, because as the law stands, they could possibly have been found guilty of assisting a suicide, and the sentence is up to 14 years imprisonment. This is surely not what the current law was designed to achieve. The other unexpected consequence of this episode was that Dignity in Dying asked me to join their board, which pleased my mother immensely. Another direct but unplanned consequence is the much higher level of suicides as people decide to end their lives while they still can. We at Compassion in Dying have done substantial research on this subject and published it. And the story related by the surviving relatives or the would-be suicide who has failed is consistently, "I wanted to do it while I still could." The knowledge that a safe and painless way out was available would remove this driver, as well as it making it unnecessary for the wealthier few to go to Switzerland. Many of those going to Dignitas in Switzerland say they're doing it at an earlier stage than they'd like to, in case they become too ill to travel. Interestingly, the travel ban during lockdown was not applied to people travelling for an assisted death, which is illegal at home. I don't see the moral or even the legal logic in this, but it was a compassionate act by the government. Interestingly, the experience in Oregon has been that only a small minority of people granted the right to assisted dying actually take it up. They're comforted to know it's there and the need to consider an amateur suicide or a premature trip abroad is obviated. Now, as I mentioned before, I regularly hear opponents of assisted dying claim the new law would remove or reduce protection for the vulnerable from coercion. Actually, the opposite is the case. Clearly defined legislation would offer much more chance of protection to the vulnerable. At present, such coercion can only be detected, if at all, after the death, and if something is brought to the attention of the police, which doesn't happen very often. Surely, if there's any risk of coercion, there's more chance of it being spotted if the person concerned is interviewed by the two doctors and the judge, who know what signs to look for, rather than be identified after someone is dead, which is what happens today and is not bringing very much protection. There's also the slippery slope argument that legislation will become ever looser and lead to euthanasia and eugenics. We haven't got the time now for detailed statistics, but 24 years experience in Oregon shows absolutely no evidence of a slippery slope and no relaxation of the criteria. There's a lot that's wrong with our societal attitude to death and dying. Clinicians have a near monopoly on decision-making at the end of life, a status quo that assumes they'll decide for people rather than with them. There's limited opportunity for people to speak openly about how they want to die, and this has left a vacuum in which a moral and ethical fudge around end-of-life treatment and choice has manifested itself. Why are the norms of medical practice not constructed around the needs and preferences of the patient? We've seen a huge improvement in the attitude of medical professionals, but there's further to go, and a need to recognise that most non-professionals have not yet been equipped with the tools they need to handle many of the end-of-life challenges. What you can do today is express your legally binding wish to refuse treatment under certain circumstances. You set them out in an advance directive or a living will, and you register it. Unfortunately, death and dying are not comfortable subjects for a large number of people, and for some communities they're almost taboo. So only around 5% of the UK population has a living will. Unfortunately, too many doctors also don't understand that they're legally binding, and as far as I know, they're not taught about them at medical school. I was a director of the campaigning organisation Dignity in Dying for a little over the maximum permitted term of 6 years. For the past 3, I've been a trustee and treasurer of the sister charity Compassion in Dying. We share premises and most of the staff with Dignity in Dying, but you can't be a charity if you're advocating something illegal. So Compassion in Dying does not campaign, but makes no secret of its support for terminally ill people to know their rights and be supported in asserting them. We offer a range of services from information, both online and by phone, specialist support to local authorities and health trusts, minority groups, free legal documentation on living wills, and extensive research on end-of-life issues, including for the NHS and for Parliament. All with a team of around 20 staff, plus the unpaid trustees. I won't go into more detail. The website's there if you want to take a look. But in short, we're one of the very few organisations trying to help the dying take what control they still can. Now, one remarkable thing about social change is how often the transition between the past and the present seems so seamless in retrospect. Women's suffrage, civil rights movement, equal marriage. It's sometimes easy to overlook the fact that people had to fight for these things even to be recognised as valid concerns, let alone get them written into our statute books. I think future generations will look back in astonishment at the way we treat the terminally ill. They'll question why successive parliaments failed to act when research had already shown them that thousands of people are affected. And I'm not using this figure for hyperbolic effect. Compassion in Dying has published serious research to back up these figures. Our laws will be viewed as just as barbaric and nonsensical as, say, withholding pain relief during childbirth, which is a policy that both the Church of England and many in the medical profession once advocated. It wasn't actually until Queen Victoria demanded pain relief during the birth of Prince Leopold that objections began to fade away. Now we expect the experience of childbirth to be a partnership between clinicians and the pregnant women, and people are given a choice over when, where and how they'll give birth. We only need to think of counter-arguments which sound ludicrous today, but which we use to try and stop the progress of women's suffrage, equal marriage, abolition of slavery, and most changes that granted freedoms. Another common argument against assisted dying is that it's unnecessary because we have palliative care and hospices. We have palliative care specialists and hospital directors on our boards, and they are quite clear that no matter how good the care is, some people cannot be helped and will suffer unbearably as they die. Palliative care is unfortunately not an all-encompassing fix. The sensible answer is to invest more in palliative care for the many, instead of leaving the sector to rely heavily on charity funding, whilst addressing the assisted dying required by the very, very few. They're complementary, they're not mutually exclusive. Finally, I haven't spent time on discussion of faith-based objections, because I don't believe that any faith has the right to impose its beliefs on others. I find an argument such as only God can choose when we die quite ridiculous when expressed by someone who accepts medicines or the use of a mechanical ventilator to save him from dying of COVID. In any case, an assisted dying law would give choice to the dying, not impose obligations on them. If you believe the action is immoral, you don't have to take it. The same applies to the disabled. The law proposed is nothing to do with euthanasia or eugenics, has nothing to do with disability, only with terminal illness. Gentlemen, I hope I've given you something to think about.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Cameron. I'm just going to try and go back into gallery mode, see what questions we have for you.
I've got half an hour, so we rattle through it.
Okay, so let me just, Little, I think, was first with his hand up. So we need to get you unmuted. Dare I say it? You need to unmute yourself, Little. You should be.
Yeah, I have done.
Well done. Okay.
Might I direct my question, please, to the speaker? Very interesting subject it was, but I'm worried about the legal beagles getting their hands on anything like this. Would it in any way interfere with things if the legal beagles weren't allowed to interfere? That's my question.
I'm not certain I understand your question. The legal involvement obviously comes at two stages. The first legal involvement is the passing of the law in Parliament, which I've tried to summarise. The other involvement of the law is simply one issue. It's after the two doctors separately have decided that the person is terminally ill and understands what they're doing, and in their view is not being encouraged to die by an unscrupulous relative or whomever, that a High Court judge should review the paperwork and meet the person and say that he agrees the person is not being compelled and understands what they're doing and understands the choices. So I don't think there is any other legal interference that can become involved. I suppose if we speculate, you might find a relative coming along and calling a lawyer up and saying, my mother is being forced into this by my brother, but none of you have spotted it, and I want it stopping. And I imagine a civil case might start brewing on the back of something like that. But I would imagine it would be extremely rare.
Thank you.
Okay. Do we have any more? Do we have any more questions for Cameron? Okay, well, we have at least two. Colin.
Hello, am I unmuted?
You are unmuted.
Okay, yeah. We mentioned absence of coercion, but it seems to me that absence of coercion is not quite the same as so coercion is not quite the same as the absence of discouragement from taking that route. I'm thinking of a woolly area in the middle where there may be motivation by relatives to be more open to this, where if that motivation hadn't been present, they would be actively discouraging it. And is there any plan to not just determine that there was no coercion, but also that there was no that there was an absence of motive from people around that patient?
I think that would be awfully difficult to do, Colin. I
Yes.
suspect we have to be mind readers to get into that. I mean, clearly you don't know what goes on within a family, and you're never going to be able to prevent people expressing their opinions. What we've got, if you step back to what we've got now, we've got circumstances where there is no protection at all. If the person is coerced or encouraged or not discouraged from committing suicide, you don't find out about it until the event has happened. I mean, I didn't put it in my talk, but my mother attempted suicide and failed. But that was through depression, and there was no one around trying to coerce her. I think her circumstances were probably the most common, in that the person doesn't want to be a burden. That's the thing you most often hear expressed by people as they get older, depressed or approaching dementia, or have got a terminal illness. And I fear I've got to answer your question by saying all we can try and do is provide a law that provides much more protection than the current one does. But I accept you might be right. I just don't see how you could address that.
Okay, I think Malcolm was next, I think.
Unmuted, thank you. Thanks, Cameron. You quite rightly mentioned the role of palliative care, and I mean, declaring an interest. I had particular positive experience of that in the case of my late wife a few years ago. What was I saying? Is your organisation open to campaigning for increased resources to go into that? Because in our case, it was a very good solution to end-of-life care. Do you see it as a viable alternative to what you're campaigning for?
No, we don't see it as an alternative. We see it as complementary to.
Right.
I mean, we have on Compassion in Dying and Dignity in Dying's board, we have a chap called Mark Jarman Howe, who's chief executive of a large group of palliative care hospices in East Anglia. We have Dame Barbara Munro, who is on the board of the Marie Curie. We are about to produce, it'll be early next year, a joint booklet on end-of-life issues with the Hospice Association.
Okay.
So we are very open with them. We give talks and support. We send people into hospices to give advice on things like living wills. We give free legal documentation and so on to any other movement or charity that wants to use it and brand it under their own names. And that's taken up by various hospices and so forth. So no, we see it very much as working together, but simply an acceptance. There are a tiny number of people who can't be helped. Excuse me 1 sec, someone's hammering on my door. Won't be a sec.
Variation on Saved by the Bell.
Bill,
Yes, Little.
is Peter Waterhouse there?
No, he's not with us this morning.
Yeah, just push her through the door, Henry. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. Sorry about that. This is the pleasure of living next door to a church, and one of the flower ladies came in to ask me for the keys. I open and close the church each morning and evening because it's one of those lovely Norman church, and it's open every day. To the public, because I live next door.
Is that in Ripley?
Wisley.
Wisley.
Yeah.
Well, Cameron, thank you for. I'm encouraged by the collaboration and whatever. And can I just sneak a quick supplementary in? You're highlighting there's definitely a trend of even medical organisations towards becoming at least neutral towards what you're campaigning for. if you were to guess, I mean, how close are we to it coming back to the into the legal, or into the legislative world, and for another decision to be taken? How close are we?
We think we are fairly close, and I'll tell you why. When it passed in the House of Lords in 2015, it then went to the Commons, and it was defeated in the Commons. It is back in front of the House of Lords now. Dame Molly Meacher has presented a bill. It's coming up for its second reading. She is the chair of Dignity in Dying, but has been a very vocal supporter in the House of Lords. Touch wood, we are pretty confident that it will again get through the Lords. We have made a tactical decision to put most of our campaigning support at the moment behind a bill that is going to the Scottish Parliament, because there is a majority of support in the Scottish Parliament. And we believe that if it goes through the Scottish Parliament, which wouldn't be before the end of next year, because it has to go to a sort of a public consultation first, not a referendum, but a broad consultation. But we're pretty confident it'll get through in Scotland. Vast support in the press in Scotland. And that will put the Westminster Parliament in a very strange position if you can just pop up the M1 and have access to it. Ireland, it's going through. Jersey, it's going through. Guernsey got very close to it, but withdrew it. But it'll be. We are hoping that we will get it through Boris's Parliament, but he's pretty damn difficult to grasp and pin down. Matt Hancock was very, very supportive, but we're not as sure at the moment what the Department of Health think about it. But hopeful, and we work hard on it. Political campaigning is a large part of what Dignity in Dying does. Press is very supportive. Times are actively in favour, Daily Mail in favour, The Sun in favour. There's hardly a major newspaper that's not in favour now. And the votes, the Ipsos Mori, etc., polls are, for the last, at least 5, 6, 7 years, have shown public support above 80%.
Okay, thank you. I've got a hand raised from a while ago by Mike, and I've seen Peter and James have also got questions in. So we will get round to everybody in June. I'm just wondering, do I need to unmute you, Mike? I think you might be.
No, I think, am I?
You're fine, you're fine. I can hear you fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cameron, thanks for your talk. My question really is about the nature of the thinking that goes on in your organisation, and around the area of definitions. For example, you mentioned on many occasions terminal illness. You also mentioned the word life, both of which words require some constant review of definition. Terminal illness, for example, many illnesses that were not so long ago regarded as terminal are certainly no longer guaranteed to be terminal. And the second thing is that there seems to be very little consensus around the definition of what constitutes life. So my question to you is, within your organization, whilst your stated beliefs and claims are quite clear, are they consistently under review within the definitions that I've talked about?
Yes, I understand your question completely. It's not just terminally ill. Our original bill, when I first got involved at Dignity in Dying, the intention was to go for a bill that would say someone is likely to die within the next year. This clearly wasn't going down too well with anyone who had an objection, and that was an easy thing to pick on, I think. And your argument was a very, very valid one about a year's time. So that has, within the proposed bill, been tightened up to a doctor, the two individual doctors separately, certifying that in their belief the person has a terminal illness which is likely to kill them within the next 6 months. So you're not looking at someone who's got early stage motor neuron disease or even cancer. You're looking at someone who is in an advanced stage of a terminal illness. And again, motor neuron disease is unlikely to hit that definition, because you really can be kept alive a disturbingly long time with very advanced motor neuron disease. Now, where you get to the difficulty with the definition of life, you're really talking about people, I think, who have got into a sort of a vegetative state. You know, their heart might be still beating, there's still signals in the brain and so forth. And that person could be kept alive for donkey's years. The assisted dying bill would not help them, because they don't have mental capacity to decide what they want to do. And they don't have the physical means of taking the life-ending drug. And this is not a law that would allow anyone else but the dying person to administer that drug themselves. The issue then, which we of course we do still advise on wearing my compassion in dying hat, is that if you write a properly worded living will, you will say that when I reach a certain level of vegetative state, or I've had such terrible injuries that I'm highly unlikely to recover from them, I do not wish to continue treatment, and I wish life-supporting treatment to be withdrawn. And that can be legally binding. There's a great perception amongst a lot of people that in those conditions, the doctors will listen to what the relatives want. And the doctors should listen to what the relatives want, but they have no obligation to act upon what the relatives want. Even if the relatives say, I know my mother would have wanted this, it has no legal status, whereas a living will does have a legal status. So I think two separate issues, but yes, we certainly keep them under review and have changed the proposed legislation to take that into account.
Thank you.
Okay, now I think next up was Peter. Peter Exworthy, you had your hand up?
Yes, indeed. Obviously, Cameron, you see progress being made in the movement in public opinion and the vote of the doctors and other bodies you mentioned. But they've gone to a position of neutrality, or sitting on the fence, you might say. Is that acceptable, do you think? Do they have an obligation to be more positive in a situation like this?
We believe strongly that they do, and in fact we have a major fight with the BMA. I don't know whether you're familiar with it, but the BMA represents doctors. It has about something like 170,000 members, and a poll was carried out through the BMJ magazine last year of the doctors, and they got a response of something like 40%, which is very high. And of that 40%, 61% were in favour, and 39% were either neutral or against. Sorry, I'm getting these figures wrong. There was over 50% were in favour, 36% were anti, and about 15% were undecided. The BMA is like an old-fashioned trade union. They have their Congress, which they had this week, and there's only 400 members of that Congress who actually make the policy decisions on behalf of the 170,000 members, purporting to reflect the views of the members, but the members don't have a vote. Only the people present and within the BMA have a vote. So it's only the 400 of them who actually have a vote, and they chose to interpret the BMJ thing as being in doctors not being overwhelmingly supportive, even though it was only 36% who were against it. So we certainly believe they should have come out supportive, but we're grateful Ian came out as neutral, as it was a close vote at the BMA.
Okay, James, did you have your hand up a minute ago? And do we need to, I think we need to unmute you. You need to unmute yourself.
Right. Yeah, thank you, Cameron. That was a very, very lucid and comprehensive presentation. I just wondered, do you have any concerns or misgivings yourself about the application of assisted dying?
No, I think it would be quite difficult to have been involved with them for 10 years and have concerns about it. I'm not taking it lightly, and that's a slightly flippant response. But
have you ever asked yourself questions?
Oh yes, and I have had a living will for the last 25 years and have reviewed it, as has my wife and my daughter, and as did my parents. I mean, bear in mind the way I was brought up. This was something that we discussed in our family, so it's been something I've thought about since I was a kid at school. I remember talking about it in the debating society when I was at school. Yes, I think seriously about it.
Well done. Just a little supplementary question. You mentioned that assisted dying has nothing to do with disability. How would Dignitas approach a lifelong disabled person who simply was tired of life and wanted to die, but was not deteriorating?
Are you asking about Dignitas or Dignity in Dying?
Dignity in Dying.
Yeah, that's fine. People do confuse them.
Yeah,
we did.
Dignitas is the clinic in Switzerland. No, we are absolutely clear that all we are looking for is to help people who are already very close to death to avoid unnecessary and extreme suffering. Now, some poor chap who's quadriplegic and in a wheelchair, I'm afraid, is not in that condition. I mean, there is the availability to take your own life. There's euthanasia available in Holland. I mean, the Dutch have had the attitude that if you decide your life's intolerable, it's your decision. But nobody else other than the Dutch. Maybe Luxembourg might drift that way. It might be that way as well. But I can think of I know of no others at all that take that attitude. And I could see if we were campaigning for that, the slippery slope argument would become a very valid one. And there are campaigning groups in Britain who are supportive of a much wider definition. And many people, you will all probably know someone who said, if I get Alzheimer's, I want you to pop me off. Don't want to end up in one of those homes.
Can you see a situation, someone in a nursing home who feels it's their duty to die?
Yes. I mean, giving you an honest answer, that my mother thought that. I mean, I think that is an absolutely common feeling within nursing homes. But, my mother had mildish Alzheimer's, but was still pretty, she had been of a simple background, but was a lucid lady. She'd been a magistrate for 40 years, a social worker, a prison visitor, she was articulate. But, had she decided I am within 6 months of death and I'm a burden and I've had enough, under our proposed law, she'd have had to have a conversation with 2 doctors where I think she'd have found it extremely difficult to suppress the expression of those opinions. These are people who are not at their bravest and strongest and so on. And I'd have to say there's pretty much an inevitability that one of the 2 doctors or the judge would be saying to her, listen, Mrs. Brown, I'm terribly sorry you feel like that, but, you cannot expect the doctor to issue you the medicine under these circumstances.
Yeah.
That's the idea. That's the idea of it.
Yeah. Thank you, Cameron. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Do we have any more questions for Cameron? Okay. Well, in which case, really, I'd now like to ask Peter Exworthy to say a few words on behalf of us all to thank Cameron for coming and speaking to us this morning.
Well, Cameron, I'd like to start with a personal thank you for your coming. I'm delighted to see you. It's nearly 3 years ago since the first invitation to your organisation went out.
Yeah, sorry about
that. Come to fruition is wonderful. We saw initially a problem, and we invited 2 speakers to follow 1 month after the other. Yeah. So we would have the 2 conflicting opinions to confuse us. The fact that it's 2 years since we heard the other one seems like only yesterday now. You have spoken very clearly, very completely, and very frankly of your side of the debate. These things are always difficult, and people get very strong in their views. But I don't think anyone ever suffers from knowing the other side of an argument. And now we know very clearly your side, and I thank you for that. I thank you for sharing the story of your parents. That was very poignant and clearly an actual moment for you in your opinions and where it's led you. You've given us a great deal to think about, great deal to ponder, and of course, at this stage of our lives, they're all getting more and more current and interesting. So on behalf of us all, thank you for coming, and thank you for your strong, caring, compassionate views. You have given us a great deal to think about. Thank you.
Thank you
Yes,
very
thank you, Cameron.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Peter. And really that concludes the main part of our breakfast. We do have a couple of men's breakfast notices before we finish. Cameron, you're very welcome to stay, but if you're pressed for time, and do feel free to leave us if you need to.
I will, Bill, because I got to get off time. But
I know time is an issue for you this morning.
Thank you, Cameron.
Yes, thanks all of you. I really enjoyed your questions. They go to the heart of the issue.
Thank you very much.
I have my thanks as well for your speaking this morning. Thank you, Cameron.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, now I did get an email from Mike last night asking for a couple of minutes just to speak. So, Mike, over to you.
Thank you, Bill. This is just a plea, really, to anybody who may know anybody, and it's regarding All Saints. You are aware of All Saints, I'm sure, part of the Leatherhead Youth Project, and doing good work in helping disadvantaged youngsters get a foot on the first rung of the work ladder. We are in financial dire straits, and at the moment our horizon is the last day of December. If we do not find additional funding by then, we will close on 31st of December. The board meeting this week showed that we had explored absolutely every conceivable avenue, and it's really, and every conceivable formal avenue, grants, etc. We continue to send out letters, but I'm afraid the general environment is extremely difficult. So I'm not necessarily asking any of you to dip your hands in your pockets, because quite frankly, we're looking at huge sums of money. But I am asking you to think of any ideas you may have that I haven't thought of, or the rest of the team haven't thought of, or anybody that you know, some exiled Russian oligarch who might be wondering what to do with a few pennies. That would be really helpful. Thank you. Thanks, Bill.
Okay, what sort of, can I ask, what sort of order of magnitude are we talking about here?
Well, over the last several years, up until pre-pandemic time, we were working on a deficit of about £20,000 to £25,000 a year. This year, we are facing a deficit of 36,000. This is a huge sum of money. I mean, basically, it comes down to the fact that because of where we are, the revenue streams are simply not big enough to keep the show on the road and to keep the number of youngsters that we support going. So we have always relied upon heavy injections of funds. At the moment, what we're trying to look at is ways of completely changing the model. But even then, we're still looking at this, working on the basis of donations as opposed to it being self-funding.
Okay, thank you. I've just got one other thing, really. At least I think it's only one other thing. Now, as things stand, we are planning for us to meet in person at a regular breakfast with Colin's bacon sandwiches next month. We will, of course, be subject to whatever rules are in place by the government, and we will be making sure we impose kind of a sensible level of distancing and other sanitary concerns. And we will publish those rules in advance. So people, if people decide that they are able to come to the breakfast, then they know what they're signing up to. So today's message really again is still watch this space, but barring a disaster, we will be going back to normal breakfast as of October. Our next meeting is in fact on the 16th, and we're hoping that's going to be at St George's. We have the booking in place, and our speaker will be Jonathan Lees from the Epsom Annual Food Bank. So, gentlemen, goodbye until then.
Okay, thanks, Bill.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you. Have a good weekend, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.